All right. This video is going to be called Artie Laing, Politics of Experience. It is one of Artie Lang's later works. I don't believe it is the latest, but it is an experiment. I mean, not an experiment, but it is a work worth exploring, and he has a lot of provocative thoughts to share. So this is going to be my first time, I guess, kind of teaching it, doing a summary of it, trying to grapple it with you guys, trying to make it digestible. I personally found it a little bit confusing, especially because it is about social phenomenology, and it goes really back and forth, and there's all these crucial relations that you can just get lost in if you're not paying attention. And my attempt here is to make it clear, make it and again, make it digestible. Okay, so who is Artie Laing? Artie Laing is a psychoanalyst and a psychiatrist. This book came out in the 1960s. Well, it was published in the 1960s. Artie Laing was particularly concerned with schizophrenia and, the different kinds of families, varieties of human experience, which is what this book will be about. And he would experiment with LSD. I think in Wikipedia he's called the, what do they call him? The LSD Marxist. I'll be honest, Artie Laing is quite a controversial figure, but he was a part of the anti-psychiatry movement, where he preached for more humane relations in treating mental illness. And I think the politics of experience really gets why this is important and the context of why Artie Laing is talking about this. But okay, so let's dive into it. The first chapter is called Persons and Experience. And the subtitle for this first section that I will be going over is called Experience as Evidence. Right from the beginning, Artie Laing says that facts become fictions without adequate ways of seeing the facts. And this is where he's going to bring up that we need to, and what Artie Laing is referring to when he calls these as, what do we mean by seeing the facts? Or what are we not seeing about the facts? And most of the time, what we call facts in psychology, because this is what he's going to be talking about, or kind of referring to, especially with science, is that we're very obsessed with behaviors and how things behave and the patterns that they show. And we would call those the facts. But Artie Laing says that is not quite true unless we know how we got there. And so we can see other people's behavior, but not their experience. And this has led people to insist that psychology has nothing to do with other people's experience, but only with their behavior. And this is what Artie Laing says. And And he will bring up that this is the task of social phenomenology, which is to study the relation between my experience and the other's experience. So it's from experience to experience. And this is what R.D. Laing will call inter-experience. But how do we study from experience to experience? Because R.D. Laing will identify experience as invisible, right? But the experience of each other is not inside of us. That's a very important distinction I must add before we go forward, is that our experiences of each other is not inside of us, but invisible. This is something that R.D. Laing is very adamant about. He's very adamant about expressing this. Okay, so an example that he uses is that your experience of me equals me as you experience me. If that can get really confusing even just by hearing it, but to break this down a little bit further, it means my behavior is the experience of the other. Now, R.D. Laing will say that the experience used to be called the soul. And I think that's why he keeps stressing that experience is invisible to man. But what's interesting about R.D. Laing calling it invisible to man is that he takes this invisible thing called experience and says that experience is the only thing that is evident because it is invisible. That's a really bold claim. I mean, it's definitely not our traditional claim, and considering that he's coming from, the 1960s, to be saying that the invisible, because it is invisible, that it is evident more than anything else, really points to how controversial R.D. Laing was when he started writing these things. But R.D. Laing provokes a very interesting question following afterwards, saying, how can one ever study the experience of the other? Right? Because if experience is invisible to each other, how can we study it? And he says here, we only experience each other as experiencing, but cannot experience the other's experience. Meaning, in social phenomenology, we have to infer from both of our behaviors towards each other as we both experience them. If that's still confusing, a better way to look at this is when two people interact with each other, our experience is invisible. But, for example, if I'm eating an apple and a man comes up to me and says that the apple I'm eating is his apple, and he gets aggressive towards me, and I get defensive because of his aggressiveness. Okay, so let me break this down. What's happening right now is that I'm interpreting his behavior, and because I'm interpreting his behavior, I'm responding. But the way I'm responding isn't actually the way I'm responding. What does that mean? It means that I'm also interpreting my behavior as I respond to him. Okay? So that means that I am interpreting his behavior and my own behavior, which we would call my experience. The thing is, he also has an experience, but his experience will probably be different because he is interpreting his own behavior towards me, and he is interpreting my behavior towards him. And that's what he would call his experience. So I hope that makes it more simple to digest and to understand. And just to clarify again, basically, one individual has to interpret their own behavior and the other's behavior, and that's what we would call one's own experience, and vice versa with the other person. And that's what I find really phenomenal about Artie Laing, is that this is something we traditionally don't think about quite often, and it makes our relations with each other interesting, because now you can see how much interpretation is going on within experiences of each other, and how we interpret our own behavior and how they interpret their behavior and our behavior. It gets really complicated, and Laing feels that this is a necessity, and it's mysterious about how this functions, and that we need to find a method to understand this. And, he will say natural sciences currently, in the 1960s, they know nothing of the relationship between behavior and experience. This is completely mysterious. And if we don't develop some way of understanding it, Artie Laing feels that the whole structure of theory and practice will collapse. And he makes a point to say him talking about the relationship between experience and behavior. It's not about trying to point out something about subjectivity or objectivity or inner and outer. He's not about that. He's saying that experience is not even an intrapsychic process. What he's saying is that all of these are modalities of experience. And I think this is where he might lose people, but nonetheless, it is provocative. It is provocative. So what are some of the things that Artie Laing identifies as modalities of experience? Okay, so just to give you an example of something outer and inner, Artie Laing would say perception is an outer and imagination is an inner. But this he lumps up as modalities of experience. So if I'm understanding correctly, and it could be a horrible misreading of this, subjectivity, objectivity, all these distinctions, they're all just modalities of experience. And to give a couple more examples of what he calls what would be a part of these modalities of experience would be fantasy, dreams, memories, and so on. And why is Artie Laing talking about this? Well, he's saying that it seems our experience is split, like we have split experiences, meaning we have only been paying attention so far to outer experiences, not inner world experiences. And I want to stress inner world because it's not inside. And Artie Laing stresses about the inner and not inside. Because he feels that experience is not inside of our heads. Experience is the psyche, and psyche is experience. And to quote him on this, he will say, "My experience is not inside my head. My experience of this room is out there in the room." And it's crazy because it's we typically view things so cut clear in terms of like, this is inside of my head and so on, but it seems like experience for Laing really has a more broad reach. Basically, everything that's invisible would be experience. And that's why he would say, my experience of this room is out there in the room. Right? It's not inside my head. And R.D. Laing would say, if we call experience intrapsychic, his rebuttal is that presupposes that there is a psyche that experience is inside of. And so, as you can see, R.D. Laing is calling for what seems to me a qualification for experience, or experience as something that should be taken seriously. If anything, I think he's calling for a reinterpretation of what we deem as experience, because that's what really changed my perspective as I read this, is that we typically call experience as something just like viewpoint. Viewpoint experience. From my point of view, this is my experience. We always seem to locate experience as where the object, this space-time object is. But no, R.D. Laing would say, no, that's not true. Right? My experience is out there. And it's not inside of me. And I think that's enough to really address the first chapter, as experience is evidence, right? It's the only thing evident for R.D. Laing. And to end it with a quote, R.D. Laing will say, "Many people used to believe that the seat of the soul was somewhere in the brain. Since brains began to be opened up frequently, no one has seen the soul. As a result of this and like revelations, many people do not now believe in the soul. Who could suppose that angels move the stars, or be so superstitious as to suppose that because one cannot see one's soul at the end of a microscope, it does not exist?" And I hope, if anything, to summarize here in the Politics of Experience, the first section, Persons and Experience, R.D. Laing is addressing a task of social phenomenology, something that the natural science has neglected. He identifies experience as the only evidence because it is invisible. We have only addressed outer experiences and not inner experiences. And inner experiences do not imply inside. which is a very important distinction. And I think that basically summarizes exactly what is going on in this first section. But anyways, guys, if you really enjoyed how I broke this down, or if I could improve in some way, this is my first time kind of just teaching this through and summarizing it and going it over. If there's still concepts that maybe seem vague, yeah, just leave questions down below and let me know how it went for you guys. I would really like to know. All right, take care.